The moment the vampire king found the ninth loaf of bread was the moment Linnea's world ended. For 9 winters, she had left the offering at the sealed door of the West Wing, a simple, anonymous act of pity for whatever lost soul was trapped within the king's cold fortress. She was only a baker's assistant, a girl with flour on her hands and sorrow in her past, invisible to the court and its remote, terrifying master. He was Lord Valerius, a king of shadow and ice, whose heart was said to have frozen over centuries ago. But when he found the humble offering, he didn't feel anger at the trespass. For the first time in 500 years, he felt hope. If you believe that the quietest kindness can echo louder than any decree, type devotion below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the silence in the king's castle. It was a silence that had teeth. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness that felt heavier than stone. It emanated from the castle's sealed west wing, and from the lord of the castle himself. Linnea had worked in the kitchens of Blackwood Manor for 10 years, since she was a girl of 16, and she had learned the geography of that silence well. She was a baker's assistant, though at 26, she was far too old for the title. She should have been a master baker by now, with her own shop and apprentices. But Linnea was quiet. She was overlooked. Her skill was undeniable. Her bread had a lightness, a warmth that seemed almost magical, but her presence was as soft as the flour that always dusted her apron. The head baker, a sour man named Mr. Grimsby, took credit for her creations and paid her a pittance. Her own sorrow was a quiet thing, too. She had lost her family to a winter fever years ago, leaving her utterly alone. It was that memory of being forgotten, of being cold and hungry in a world that had moved on without her, that first drew her to the castle's own forgotten soul. The story, whispered among the staff, was that the West Wing was sealed by the king's own hand centuries ago. Some said it held a monster. Others, a mad wife. The oldest servants whispered it held his greatest failure, a treasure he had lost and could not bear to look upon. Whatever the truth, no one went near it. The corridor leading to it was perpetually cold, the air thick with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. 9 years ago, on the first anniversary of her family's passing, Linnea had been unable to bear the oppressive cheer of the servants' hall. She'd taken a small, warm loaf of rye, her best work, and walked the forbidden corridor. The cold was immediate, seeping into her bones, making the candle in her hand gutter and shrink. At the end of the hall was a single immense door of black oak, banded with iron that was slick with a thin, unnatural frost. There were no hinges, no handle, no keyhole. It was sealed as if it were part of the very stone. She had felt a wave of despair so potent it nearly brought her to her knees. It was the feeling of absolute isolation. She thought of her mother, her father, her little brother, gone. She thought of herself alone in this vast, cold place. And she felt a kinship with whatever was behind that door. Without thinking, she had placed the warm loaf on the stone floor before the door. A simple offering. A quiet message that said, "You are not entirely forgotten." She had done it every week since, for 9 years. 468 loaves of bread, left in the cold and the dark. She never knew what happened to them. By the time she returned the following week, the previous loaf was always gone. She told herself mice or rats took it, but she knew that was a lie. Nothing lived in this part of the castle. The silence was too complete. Tonight was the first night of the 10th winter. The wind howled outside, throwing handfuls of sleet against the high arched windows. Linnea clutched a small round loaf of sourdough, its crust still crackling softly, the warmth a small shield against the creeping chill of the corridor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the same way it did every time. This was a foolish, dangerous ritual. If she were ever discovered, she would be dismissed without a reference, cast out into the winter. She reached the great black door. The cold was worse than ever tonight, a biting, predatory thing. The shadows in the corners of the long hall seemed to deepen, to stretch and writhe at the edge of her vision. She quickly bent down, placing the loaf on the frosted flagstones. Her fingers brushed the icy floor, and she shivered, a deep, convulsive tremor. "I know you are there," she whispered, her breath turning to mist. "I hope this brings you some small comfort." She turned to leave, her boots silent on the stone. But a voice, low and resonant as a cello string, stopped her dead. "It does." Linnea froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She did not turn around. She could not. The voice had come from behind her, from the impenetrable darkness at the far end of the hall. It was a voice she had heard only twice in 10 years, from a great distance, as he addressed the assembled household. It was the voice of the king, Lord Valerius. She felt, more than saw, his approach. The temperature in the corridor dropped another 10 degrees. The flame of her candle shrank to a tiny blue bead, then extinguished, plunging her into near total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through a distant window. A profound stillness settled around her, the stillness of a predator that has ceased its hunt because its prey is already cornered. "For 9 years," the voice continued, closer now, directly behind her shoulder. The sound vibrated through her bones. "468 times you have come here. You have left an offering. I have watched you. I have waited." Linnea's mind was a white blank of terror. He knew. He had always known. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, for the furious command that would seal her ruin. "Turn around, girl," he commanded. It was not a shout. It was quieter than that, and far more terrifying. It was a statement of absolute authority. Slowly, stiff with fear, she turned. He stood so close she could have reached out and touched the fine black wool of his coat. Lord Valerius was taller than she'd imagined, a figure of long, elegant lines and impossible stillness. In the gloom, his face was a mask of pale, aristocratic beauty, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing. But it was his eyes that held her. They were not the cold gray she had imagined. They were the color of deepest twilight, and in their center, a faint, unmistakable glint of crimson. The supernatural signals the staff whispered about were all true. The inhuman cold, the shadows that seemed to cling to him, to move with a life of their own, the unnerving stillness. He was not just a reclusive lord. He was something other, something ancient and dangerous. He did not look at her face. His gaze was fixed on the simple loaf of bread at the foot of the door. He knelt, a surprisingly fluid and graceful movement for a man so large, and reached out a long-fingered, pale hand. He did not touch the bread. He held his hand just above it, his fingers hovering over the warm crust. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. The question was not angry. It was curious. Genuinely, deeply curious. Linnea found her voice, though it was a trembling whisper. "For the one inside, my lord. For the one who is alone." He finally lifted his gaze to her face, and for the first time, Linnea felt truly seen. His eyes were not just looking at her. They were reading her, peeling back the layers of fear and loneliness to the core of her, to the quiet ache of compassion that lived there. He saw the girl who had lost her family. He saw the woman who was dismissed and invisible. He saw it all in a single, breathless moment. A strange expression crossed his features. It was not pity. It was something closer to wonder. The crimson in his eyes deepened, swirling like wine in a glass. "You feel it, don't you?" he said softly. "The sorrow in this place." She could only nod, her throat tight. He rose to his full height, a towering shadow in the gloom. He looked from her to the door and back again. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Linnea braced herself. "The rest of my staff," he said, his tone flat and cold. "They feel only fear. They tell stories of monsters. They see only a threat. But you saw a prisoner. You felt a sadness, and you answered it. Not with fear, but with this." He gestured to the loaf. "With warmth, with life." He took a step closer. The shadows in the hall pooled around his feet like spilled ink. "I have a use for that compassion. I have a use for you." His hand came up, and for a terrifying second, she thought he meant to strike her. Instead, his fingers brushed her cheek. His touch was not the burning cold of the corridor's frost. It was cool, like marble that had lain in the moonlight, smooth and strangely gentle. "You will no longer work in the kitchens," he stated, his crimson eyes holding hers captive. "You belong to me now." The words should have sounded like a threat, a sentence. But in the ringing silence of the corridor, laced with the impossible hope she saw dawning in his ancient eyes, they sounded like something else entirely. They sounded like a claim. The next morning, the king's decree descended upon the kitchens like a thunderclap. Linnea, the quiet baker's girl, was to be removed from her duties. Her belongings were to be moved to the saffron suite, a set of chambers in the main wing of the castle, adjacent to the king's own. She was to be placed in the personal service of Lord Valerius himself. Mr. Grimsby turned a mottled shade of purple, sputtering that it was impossible, a mistake. The other servants stared, their faces a mixture of shock, envy, and suspicion. Linnea stood frozen by the great hearth, her hands coated in flour, as the king's steward, a severe man named Alistair, formally read the proclamation. "Miss Linnea," Alistair said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "His lordship awaits you in the library, at once." She was escorted from the kitchens, leaving a cloud of flour and stunned silence in her wake. She was led through parts of the castle she had only ever glimpsed. Grand halls with soaring ceilings, galleries filled with portraits of pale, dark-eyed ancestors, corridors where the carpets were so thick her footsteps made no sound. The saffron suite was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. It had a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in gold velvet, and windows that overlooked the king's private night garden. It was a cage of bewildering luxury. She felt like a field mouse brought into a palace, utterly out of place. After a maid helped her change into a simple but well-made woolen dress, she was led to the library. The library was the heart of the castle's silence. It was a vast, two-story rotunda, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with books. A rolling ladder snaked along the curved shelves. The only light came from a massive, multi-tiered chandelier of candles and the roaring fire in a hearth large enough to stand in. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax, and of him. That scent of winter and old stone. Lord Valerius stood with his back to her, gazing into the flames. He wore the same black coat as the night before. The shadows in the room seemed to obey him, clinging to his shoulders, pooling at his feet, leaving the rest of the room in a warm, flickering glow. "My lord," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned. In the firelight, his face was less a mask and more a study in contradictions. The sharp, severe lines of his jaw and cheekbones spoke of command, but his mouth had a gentler curve than she'd noticed. And his eyes. Today, they were a deep, thoughtful violet, the crimson flare banked to a mere ember. "Come here," he said, gesturing to a pair of leather armchairs by the fire. She obeyed, her legs unsteady. She perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He sat opposite her, the firelight playing over his still, pale features. "You are afraid," he stated. "Yes, my lord." It was the simple truth. "You have no reason to be. Not from me." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "Last night, I told you I had a use for you. I will explain. But first, you must understand what is behind that door." He began to speak, and the story he wove was one of grief and rage, of magic and betrayal. The person sealed in the West Wing was not a monster or a mad wife. It was his twin sister, Calla. 500 years ago, Valerius said, his voice losing its formal edge, becoming something deeper, rougher with ancient pain. We were different. Our line has always been tied to the shadows, to the night. We lived longer, felt more deeply. We were not yet what I have become. We were rulers, yes, but we walked in the sun. He spoke of a rival lord, a sorcerer named Malachi, who coveted their lands and their power. Malachi could not defeat Valerius in open conflict, so he struck at his sister. He laid a curse upon her, a spell of frozen time. It did not kill her, Valerius said, his hands clenching into fists on the arms of his chair. It was crueler than that. It locked her in a stasis, a perfect, deathless winter. Her body is as it was the day the curse fell. Her heart does not beat. Her lungs do not draw breath. She is trapped in a moment, an unchanging crystal of a person, cold to the touch. The cold in the castle, Linnea realized. It wasn't just the king. It was emanating from the cursed princess in the West Wing. I flew into a rage. I hunted Malachi, but he was powerful. He escaped, and I have not found him since. The curse was absolute. It fed on itself, creating an aura of profound cold and despair that began to leach the life from the very stones of the castle. I had no choice but to seal the wing, to contain the magic before it consumed everything. I used my own power to forge the seal. Nothing could get in. Nothing could get out. He fell silent, staring into the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making him look impossibly weary. I believed nothing could reach her. For centuries, I have felt her in there, cold and alone. The despair you felt in that corridor. It is a mere echo of what she is trapped in. I have tried every magic, consulted every ancient text. Nothing worked. The seal held, and the cold remained. He turned his gaze back to Linnea, and his eyes were burning with a desperate intensity. Until you. Me? She breathed. You came to that door, not with magic, not with power, but with simple, human kindness. You brought an offering of life, of sustenance, and you did it not once but hundreds of times, a constant, steady drip of warmth against an eternity of ice. He stood and began to pace before the fire. For the first 8 years I felt nothing, but this last year, something changed. A flicker. A tiny, faint spark of warmth in the heart of the unending winter of her curse. It was so small I thought I was imagining it. But it grew, week by week, with every loaf you left. Your compassion, your stubborn, quiet devotion, it is doing what no magic of mine could. It is reaching her. He stopped in front of her, looking down at her. The bread is not just bread, Linnea. When you bake it, with your intent, with your pity for the one you thought was lost, it becomes more. It becomes a vessel, a conduit for warmth, for life. He knelt before her, just as he had in the corridor, taking her small, flour-dusted hands in his own. His skin was cool but not cold. It was smooth and firm. I need you to continue, he said, his voice raw with a plea 5 centuries in the making. But not as a secret, scurrying in the dark. I need you here, with me. I will give you the finest ingredients, a kitchen of your own. I want you to cook for her every day, and I will be there. I will add my will to yours, my power to your compassion. Together, we may be able to wake her up. Linnea stared at him, her mind reeling. This terrifying, ancient being was not a monster. He was a brother, trapped in a half-millennium of grief and helplessness. The legendary coldness of the vampire king was the radiating sorrow of a broken heart. He was asking for her help. Her, the invisible girl. He had seen the one thing in her that she thought was a worthless, private ache, and he was telling her it was the most powerful thing in his world. Would you have agreed to help a creature of the night, even for a cause so pure? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. She looked at his hands holding hers. She looked into his eyes, where centuries of despair warred with a fragile, newborn hope. And she remembered the feeling in that cold corridor, the profound loneliness that had called to her own. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady. I will help you. A breath escaped his lips, a sound of such profound relief that it seemed to shake his entire frame. For a fleeting instant, the mask of the king fell away, and she saw only a man who had been given his first glimmer of light in an age of darkness. Their new life began that day. A small, pristine kitchen attached to her suite was stocked with the finest ingredients she had ever seen. Sacks of flour milled finer than silk, crocks of golden butter, honey that tasted of summer wildflowers, rare spices from lands she had only read about in books. The first time she baked for Calla under Valerius's watch was a strange and nerve-wracking affair. He did not speak. He simply stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette, his presence filling the room. The air around him was cool, but it was the shadows that were most unnerving. They seemed to stretch from his feet, pooling in the corners, attentive and alive. Linnea's hands trembled as she kneaded the dough. She felt foolish, exposed. How could her simple skill matter to a being like him? But then she remembered his words. Your compassion, is the key. She closed her eyes and thought of the cold, sleeping princess. She poured all her empathy, all her quiet hope for a reunion between brother and sister into the work of her hands. She kneaded the dough until it was smooth and pliant, a living thing beneath her palms. When she slid the loaf into the small brick oven, Valerius spoke. "Tell me about your family." The question was unexpected. She hesitated, then found herself telling him. She spoke of her father's booming laugh, her mother's gentle hands, the way her little brother Tom used to steal warm rolls from the cooling rack. The memories were painful, a familiar ache in her chest. "They are gone," she finished softly. "Nothing is ever truly gone," Valerius said, his voice a low murmur. "It simply changes form. The love you hold for them, that is a warmth that does not fade. It is the same warmth you are putting into this bread." When the loaf was done, golden brown and fragrant, he did not send a servant. He took it himself, carrying it on a simple wooden board. He led her back to the west wing. This time the cold in the corridor felt different. It was still profound, but there was a fragility to it, as if it were a sheet of ice with a tiny crack in its center. He placed the bread before the door. Then he stood beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers, and they waited in silence. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "It's stronger," he whispered. "The spark, it is brighter." He turned to her, his eyes shimmering in the gloom. "Thank you, Linnea." It became their daily ritual. The baking, the quiet conversation, the walk to the west wing. He would ask her questions, not just about her family, but about her. What did she like to read? What did she dream of? No one had ever asked her such things. No one had ever seemed to care. In return, he shared fragments of his own long life. He spoke of watching empires rise and fall, of seeing forests grow from saplings to ancient woods. He never spoke of the violence, of the feeding, of the nature of his curse. He spoke of time as a river, and of himself as a stone on its bank, watching it flow by. He showed her his loneliness without ever naming it. One evening, he led her to the library after their ritual. He pulled a heavy leather-bound volume from a high shelf. It was a book of maps, but they were maps of the stars. "This constellation," he said, his long finger tracing a pattern of faint silver stars, "is no longer visible in the sky. Its sun went dark 300 years ago, but I remember it." She looked from the page to his face, to see a star die, to carry the memory of light that no one else had ever seen. The thought was so vast, so lonely, it stole her breath. "You must miss the sun," she said softly, without thinking. His face shuddered, the familiar mask of the cold king sliding back into place. "I have not felt the sun on my skin in 5 centuries. I do not allow myself to miss it." But she saw the lie in his eyes. She saw the longing for a simple warmth he was forever denied. Her heart ached for him. Impulsively, she reached out and laid her hand on his, where it rested on the page. His entire body went rigid. It was the first time she had initiated contact. His skin was cool, as always, but beneath it, she felt a tremor, a fine vibration of shock. He stared down at her small, plain hand, covering his own pale, elegant one. The shadows in the library, which had been resting quietly in the high corners, suddenly stirred, coiling and uncoiling like smoke. He did not pull away. He slowly, deliberately, turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His grip was gentle but firm, an anchor in the vast, lonely sea of his existence. "Your hands are always warm," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. The simple touch sent a jolt through her, a heat that had nothing to do with ovens and everything to do with the man beside her. Their relationship deepened in these small, quiet moments. He would find her in the night garden, where she went to breathe the cool air. He would stand with her in silence, watching the moon. One night, a thorny rose branch snagged her sleeve. Before she could move, a tendril of shadow detached itself from the wall and gently, precisely, pushed the branch away. She stared at it, not with fear, but with wonder. The shadows were not just extensions of his power. They were extensions of his will. They were protecting her. He began to read to her in the evenings by the library fire, his low voice bringing ancient poetry and forgotten histories to life. She would watch him, the way the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, the way his eyes would soften when he read a line of particular beauty. She was falling in love with him, with the lonely man behind the terrifying legend of the Vampire King. And he, in turn, was being transformed by her. The oppressive silence of the castle began to lift. The staff whispered that they had seen him smile, a small, fleeting thing, but a smile nonetheless. The perpetual chill in the main halls seemed to lessen. Her warmth was not just reaching his sister, it was reaching him. One afternoon, as she kneaded a particularly rich dough laced with cinnamon and honey, he came and stood beside her at the marble slab. He watched her hands for a long time. "Show me," he said. She faltered. "My lord, show me how. My hands, they are always cold. I want to understand how you create such warmth." Hesitantly, she took a piece of dough and placed it before him. She guided his large, cool hands, showing him how to fold and press, how to feel the life in the dough. His touch was clumsy at first, too forceful. "It is not about strength," she said softly. "It is about listening. You have to feel what it needs." He stilled, closing his eyes. He let her guide his hands, his fingers brushing against hers. He slowed his movements, and under their combined touch, the dough seemed to sigh and yield. A faint smile touched his lips. It was the first one she had seen up close, and it was devastating. It lit his whole face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. In that moment, he was not a king or a creature of the night. He was just a man, learning to create warmth for the first time in an eternity. The spark of warmth in the west wing grew into a steady flame. Valerius could feel it now, a constant, gentle pulse of life against the ice. Hope became a tangible thing in the castle, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their days. But where light grows, it also casts a shadow. And their light had not gone unnoticed. The threat came without warning. Linnea was in the night garden, trimming dried lavender, when the air suddenly grew heavy and foul, thick with the stench of decay and bitter magic. The moon was obscured by a sickly green haze. The shadows around her, usually calm and watchful, writhed in agitation, flattening themselves against the stone walls. Before she could even call out, two figures coalesced from the thickest gloom under the yew trees. They were not men. They were constructs of shadow and rage. Their forms vaguely humanoid, but their limbs too long, their fingers ending in wicked-looking claws. Their eyes were points of malevolent green light. Linnea screamed, stumbling backward, dropping her shears. One of the creatures lunged, its claws scything through the air where her head had been a second before. but it never reached her. A blur of motion, faster than the eye could follow, slammed into the creature, sending it flying across the garden to smash against the far wall, where it dissolved with a pained hiss. Valerius stood over her, a cloak of absolute fury radiating from him. He had appeared from nowhere, a vengeful god of the night. His eyes were not crimson. They were blazing infernos of red light. The shadows of the garden did not just cling to him. They rose up around him like a legion of loyal soldiers, their forms twisting and sharpening. "You dare!" he snarled, his voice a low, guttural thunder that shook the very ground. "You dare touch what is mine!" The second creature hesitated, its green eyes widening in what looked like fear. It was a fatal pause. Valerius moved again, a streak of black lightning. He seized the creature by its throat, his fingers sinking into its smoky form. The creature writhed, but it was useless. A cold, black fire erupted from Valerius's hand, consuming the shadow thing from the inside out. It disintegrated into a shower of foul-smelling dust. Valerius stood panting in the sudden silence, the red fury slowly receding from his eyes. He turned to Linnea, his face a mask of cold terror. He knelt before her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, as if he might break her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. She shook her head, still trembling. "No, you were so fast." "Malachi," he hissed, the name a curse on his lips. He rose and scanned the garden, his entire posture a defensive crouch. "He knows. He felt the curse weakening, and he has found the source. He sent his hounds for you." He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her back inside, the shadows flowing around them like a protective tide. He did not put her down until they were in the library, with the great wooden doors barred and the fire roaring. He set her down gently in the armchair, then began to pace, his rage a palpable force in the room. "He will not stop. He will try again. I will not allow it. You will not leave these chambers. I will post guards. I will weave a ward." "No," Linnea said, her voice quiet but firm. He stopped pacing, turning to stare at her. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She stood to face him. "I will not hide. I am not a precious object to be locked away for safekeeping. You told me yourself my compassion is part of the weapon against him. Hiding me away in fear is letting him win. It's letting the cold back in." He looked at her, his expression a storm of conflict. He saw the logic in her words, but the raw, primal terror of almost losing her was warring with it. "He will kill you," he said, his voice raw. "Then he will kill me at your side," she retorted, stepping closer. "We started this together. We will finish it together. You cannot shield me from the world, Valerius. You can only stand with me in it." She had never used his name before. It hung in the air between them, a declaration. She was no longer just his servant, no longer just a baker's assistant. She was his partner. He stared at her, and the fury in his eyes gave way to a dawning awe. The world had always seen her as quiet, as meek, as someone to be overlooked. But here she was, facing down an ancient sorcerer and a furious vampire king, and refusing to back down. He was seeing the steel beneath the softness. "So be it," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion. "We face him together." They knew Malachi would strike again, and he would aim for the moment of their greatest effort. The final ritual. They planned it for the next night, the night of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. Linnea spent the day in her kitchen, but this time was different. She was not just baking bread. She was forging a weapon of light and life. She poured every ounce of her love for her lost family, for the sleeping princess, for the grieving brother who had shown her she was worthy, into the dough. She kneaded into it the memory of sunlight, the sound of laughter, the feeling of Valerius's hand in hers. Valerius did not watch from the doorway. He stood with hers. He ground the spices. He stoked the fire. His presence was a silent, steady bulwark against the fear that threatened to creep in. As dusk fell, they walked to the west wing for the last time. Linnea carried the loaf, which seemed to glow with a faint, internal warmth. It was the most perfect thing she had ever made. Valerius walked beside her, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword she had never seen him carry, its hilt wrapped in black leather. The corridor was no longer just cold. It was vibrating with malevolent energy. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Malachi was waiting. They reached the great black door. Linnea turned to Valerius. His face was pale and grim, but his eyes were steady on hers. "I am afraid," she admitted in a whisper. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But your courage is greater than your fear. It always has been." He leaned down and pressed a firm, cool kiss to her forehead. "I will not let him harm you." She took a deep breath and knelt, placing the glowing loaf before the door. She laid her hands on the warm crust, closed her eyes, and let her heart open. She didn't just think of Calla. She called to her. She sent a wave of warmth, of life, of shared hope, crashing against the icy prison. "Wake up," she pleaded silently. "Your brother is waiting. The sun is waiting." A tremor ran through the stone floor. A brilliant golden light began to radiate from the bread, pushing back the oppressive gloom. A loud crack echoed through the hall as a fissure appeared in the center of the black door. At the same instant, the far end of the corridor exploded inwards. Stone and dust flew as a figure stepped through the breach. He was tall and gaunt, clad in robes the color of dried blood, his face a web of cruel lines. It was Malachi. "So," the sorcerer hissed, his eyes fixing on Linnea. "The little mouse who thinks she can undo my masterpiece." He raised a hand, green fire coalescing around his fingers. But Valerius was already moving. He was a phantom, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat, his sword a blur of silver. "You will not touch her," Valerius roared, and their battle began. It was a war of two opposing forces. Malachi wielded magic of decay and despair, bolts of green energy and summoned tendrils of shadow. Valerius was speed and cold fury, his sword a thing of deadly grace, his own shadows rising to meet Malachi's, tearing and rending. Linnea kept her focus on the door. She could feel Calla stirring, the life within her fighting to break free. The light from the bread intensified, pouring into the crack in the door, widening it. Another crack appeared, and another. The sound was like a frozen river breaking up in the spring. Malachi saw what was happening. With a snarl of fury, he blasted Valerius back with a powerful wave of magic, then turned his full attention on Linnea. "Enough of this!" he shrieked, launching a bolt of pure necrotic energy directly at her. Linnea saw it coming, a river of sickly green death. She had no time to move, no time to even scream. She closed her eyes, but the blow never landed. Valerius appeared in front of her, his back to her, taking the full force of the spell. He cried out, a sound of pure agony, and staggered, But he did not fall. The magic washed over him, and for a horrifying moment she saw the skin on his back blacken and crack like burned parchment. He turned his head, his eyes blazing with pain and triumph. "Now, Linnea!" he yelled. With a sob, she poured the last of her strength, her hope, her very soul into the door. Live! With a sound like a peal of thunder, the great black door shattered into 1,000 pieces. A wave of pure golden warmth washed out, dispelling the corridor's chill in an instant. From the doorway, a figure emerged. A young woman, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the vibrant blue of a summer sky, blinking against the light. Calla was awake. Malachi stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Impossible! That moment of distraction was his last. Valerius, ignoring his grievous wound, lunged. His sword found its mark. The sorcerer gasped, looking down at the blade buried in his chest, then dissolved into dust and a final, bitter whisper. Silence. Calla took a hesitant step forward, her eyes finding her brother. "Valerius?" she whispered, her voice husky from centuries of disuse. He turned, the black sword clattering to the floor. He stumbled toward her, his face a ruin of pain and ecstatic joy. They met in the middle of the hall, clinging to each other. A brother and sister reunited across 500 years of winter. Linnea watched them, her heart overflowing, her body trembling with exhaustion. And then her strength gave out, and the world went dark. She awoke in the saffron suite, in the vast, velvet-draped bed. The first thing she saw was Valerius, sitting in a chair beside her, his face etched with worry. He was shirtless, and she saw his back was swathed in bandages. Calla stood by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, her blue eyes full of gentle concern. "You're awake," Valerius said, his voice thick with relief. He took her hand, his touch infinitely gentle. "You saved her. You saved us." Weeks passed. Calla's recovery was slow but steady. Her laughter, a sound unheard in the castle for half a millennium, began to echo in the halls, chasing away the last of the shadows. She and Linnea became fast friends, spending hours in the garden, which Calla was coaxing back to vibrant life. The court, however, was in an uproar. The return of the lost princess, the defeat of an ancient enemy, and the king's inexplicable favor for a low-born baker's assistant. It was a feast for gossips. Valerius put an end to it at the Grand Solstice Ball. It was the first formal event held at the castle in centuries. The hall was ablaze with light, filled with the highest nobility of the land. Linnea stood by his side, clad in a simple but elegant gown of midnight blue that Calla had insisted on for her. She felt like a fraud among these glittering, titled people, many of whom she recognized as having looked straight through her for years. Mr. Grimsby, her old master, was there, his eyes wide with disbelief and envy. When the hall was full, Valerius called for silence. He stood on the dais, Calla on one side, and then he reached for Linnea's hand, drawing her to his other side. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. "For 500 years," he began, his voice ringing with authority, "this castle has been a house of grief. My sister was lost to me, and I was lost to myself. You all knew me as a king of shadow and ice." He looked down at Linnea, his eyes full of a love so profound it silenced the entire hall. "This woman, Linnea, whom most of you have never bothered to see, came into my darkness not with power or ambition, but with a quiet and relentless kindness. With her courage, she faced down the evil that I could not defeat alone. With her compassion, she did what no king or sorcerer could. She brought back the light. He raised her hand to his lips. She is not my servant. She is my heart. She is my queen. You will show her the same respect you show me, or you will no longer be welcome in my kingdom. He then looked directly at a pale, sweating Mr. Grimsby. As for those who value status over skill and cruelty over kindness, your service is no longer required. The disgraced baker was quietly and firmly escorted from the hall. In that moment, in front of everyone who had ever dismissed her, Linnea's old wounds were not just healed, they were erased. A year later, the castle was transformed. It was a place of light and life. Calla ruled alongside her brother, her warmth and diplomatic grace tempering his ancient severity. One evening, Linnea found Valerius in the library, looking out the window at the stars. She came and stood beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but comfortable and full of unspoken affection. "Your life," he said softly, his gaze on the infinite night sky, "is like a single, beautiful heartbeat in the vastness of time. Mine is an endless river. I confess the thought of the river flowing on long after the heartbeat has ceased is a torment." She looked up at him, at his timeless, beloved face. She knew what he was offering, the gift of eternity, the curse of it. "Then don't think of the river," she whispered, placing her hand over his heart. She felt its slow, steady, unnatural rhythm. "Just listen to the heartbeat. This one. Right here. Right now. I would not trade a single day of this life for 1,000 years of any other." He looked down at her, his ancient eyes filled with a love that was deeper than time. He understood. The choice would be hers, one day, if she wanted it. But for now, this precious, fleeting mortality was the gift. "As you wish, my heart," he murmured. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss not of claiming or desperation, but of quiet, settled love. A kiss that promised not forever, but a forever of no's. And in the warm, candle-lit library of the once cold king, it was more than enough. For more stories where quiet devotion conquers ancient curses, and where being overlooked becomes the source of your greatest strength, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.